The first child did not scream, and that should have warned me. I have destroyed worlds. I have turned civilizations to ash, and watched their last embers cool against the black of space. I have crushed rebellions that lasted centuries, broken species that dared to raise their eyes to mine, and ground their memories into dust so complete that even their gods forgot them. My name is Zorath Kane, Supreme Sovereign of the Valith Dominion, ruler of 900 star systems, master of 42 vassal species, commander of a fleet that blots out the light of suns when it moves through open space. I have held power so long that the concept of fear became something I studied in others, the way one might study the behavior of insects. It fascinated me because I could no longer feel it. And then, I heard a single word from a dying child, and it ate my empire alive. Let me tell you how it happened, because I need you to understand that I did not see it coming. None of us did. Not my admirals, not my intelligence chiefs, not the finest strategic minds across 900 worlds. We were watching for warships and weapons. We never thought to watch for a word. Humanity came into my awareness the way most species do. A border probe detected their communications. A scout fleet mapped their territory. Analysts compiled reports on their military capacity, their population density, their technological level. The reports were unimpressive. Humans occupied a handful of star systems near the outer edge of what my cartographers called the disputed reach. Their fleet was small, poorly coordinated, and decades behind our weapons technology. Their population was spread thin across colony worlds that lacked the orbital defenses necessary to withstand even a mid-tier bombardment squadron. My War Council recommended a standard absorption campaign, 3 fleets, 6 weeks, a treaty on our terms. I approved it, without leaving my morning meal. That was my first mistake, though I did not know it at the time. I treated humanity the way I had treated every other conquest. I looked at their ships and their soldiers and their colonies, and I measured them by the same standards I had used for 42 other species. I never once asked what made them different. The war lasted 4 weeks, not 6. Human commanders fought with a tactical creativity that cost me more ships than I had anticipated. They used ambush tactics in asteroid fields, luring my squadrons into kill zones with decoy transmissions. They converted civilian freighters into missile platforms and launched them unmanned into my formation lines, causing chaos that their smaller, faster warships exploited with devastating precision. One human captain, commanding a destroyer barely a quarter of the size of my smallest cruiser, managed to disable 2 of my heavy frigates before her ship was overwhelmed. My battle review officers flagged her tactics for study, noting with professional admiration that she had turned every disadvantage into a weapon, but the outcome was never in doubt. We outnumbered them by a factor that made resistance a mathematical impossibility. When their central government agreed to sign the Treaty of Calvex, I considered the matter closed. The human delegation at the signing ceremony was composed of 3 individuals, 2 diplomats and a military officer. I remember noticing, with detached curiosity, that the military officer watched me throughout the ceremony with an expression I could not classify. She did not look defeated. She did not look angry. She looked at me the way a scientist might look at a natural phenomenon that she found intellectually interesting, as if I were something to be studied, as if my power, which had just crushed her entire species into submission, was a data point in an experiment whose conclusion she already knew. I dismissed the observation as insignificant. I should not have. Humanity accepted vassal status. They would work within our economic framework, provide technical labor to our industrial sectors, and surrender any military capability beyond planetary law enforcement. In exchange, they would be permitted to continue existing. It was the same deal I had offered every other conquered species. Most accepted it, with varying degrees of resentment, that faded within a generation or 2. Humans, I assumed, would do the same. Meridian 4 was a colony world on the edge of human-settled space. It housed approximately 40,000 humans in a settlement built around agricultural production and light manufacturing. My intelligence division flagged it 3 months after the treaty was signed. A signals analysis team had detected encrypted communications originating from within the colony's primary education complex, a sprawling campus of connected buildings that served as the settlement's school system. The encryption patterns matched known resistance cell signatures. I ordered the complex investigated. My intelligence chief, a Valith officer named Sarath, recommended a surgical approach: infiltration, identification of the resistance operatives, targeted arrests. I overruled him. I had been watching the reports from across human space, and I did not like what I was reading. Compliance rates were acceptable, but there was an undercurrent of something my analysts struggled to define. Not defiance exactly, but a quality in the way humans carried out their assigned tasks that suggested they were waiting for something. I wanted to send a message that would end whatever they were waiting for. I ordered the education complex surrounded by my Praetorian Guard. 3 battalions, full combat deployment. The kind of force that makes a statement purely by existing in a space. Kale Vorin, my Praetorian commander, positioned his troops in a perimeter around the campus at dawn. Scans confirmed the presence of concealed communication equipment beneath the main building. That was enough for me. I gave the order from my flagship in orbit. I did not watch it happen in real time. I was reviewing supply chain reports when Vorin reported that the operation was complete. 11 minutes. That is how long it took 3 battalions of the most elite soldiers in the galaxy to sweep through a school complex. The concealed communication equipment turned out to be a civilian emergency broadcast node, the kind of system every human settlement maintained for natural disaster warnings. It was not a resistance tool, it was a weather alert system. There were 5,731 children inside the complex when my soldiers entered. None of them survived. I want to be clear about something. At the time, I felt nothing about this number. I had ordered worse. Far worse. I had once authorized the atmospheric destabilization of a Faluri hive world that resulted in casualties numbering in the hundreds of millions. I had watched Drelkathi breeding grounds burn during their rebellion and felt only satisfaction at a strategic objective achieved. 5,000 children on a minor colony world did not register on the scale of destruction I had normalized over centuries of rule. They were collateral damage in a message I was sending. The message was more important than they were. That was how I saw it. That was how every emperor before me had seen such things. We did not count the small lives lost in the service of order. We counted only the stability that resulted. I decided to visit the aftermath personally. This was not compassion. It was theater. I wanted the galaxy to see their emperor walking through the wreckage of defiance. Unbothered, supreme, untouchable. I brought press drones from every major galactic news service. I wanted the footage broadcast across all 900 systems. I wanted every vassal species to see what happened to those who hid resistance behind the walls of schools. The campus was silent when I arrived. My guards had been efficient. The buildings were damaged but standing. The evidence of what had happened was present but controlled. Vorin had managed the scene with the precision I expected from him. I walked through corridors that smelled of smoke and something else I did not bother to identify. Classroom doors hung open, their frames buckled from the force of breaching charges. Personal belongings littered the floors, small things that told stories I was not interested in hearing. A drawing pinned to a wall with a child's handwriting across the bottom. A pair of shoes placed neatly beside a desk, as if their owner expected to come back for them. I stepped over these things without looking down. I kept my expression neutral for the cameras. I made brief remarks about the cost of defiance and the mercy of compliance. I was performing, and I was performing well. I found her in what had been a classroom on the ground floor of the eastern building. She was pinned beneath a section of collapsed ceiling, a fragment of structural beam across her legs. She was small, even by human standards. My later analysis suggested she was approximately 7 years old. She had dark hair matted with dust and a face that was pale from blood loss. My medical scanners indicated she had minutes at most. 2 of my guards moved toward her. Standard procedure. Vorin looked at me for confirmation. I waved them off. I was feeling theatrical. Here was a moment the cameras would capture perfectly. The mighty emperor, kneeling beside the last survivor, demonstrating the personal attention he gave even to the smallest matters of his domain. I knelt beside her. The press drones orbited us in a slow circle, capturing every angle. I asked her if she understood why this had happened. I used my court voice, the one calibrated to convey absolute authority without raising its volume. I told her that defiance against the Dominion carried a price, and that today her world had paid it. I asked her if she understood. She looked at me. I have seen many things in the eyes of defeated enemies: fear, most commonly; hatred, occasionally; despair, frequently; resignation, almost always. I had catalogued these expressions over centuries, filed them away as confirmation that my power was absolute and my methods effective. This child showed me none of them. Her eyes were dry, steady. There was pain in them, physical pain that must have been extraordinary given her injuries. But it was buried beneath something else, something I did not have a framework to interpret. She looked at me the way one might look at a storm, or a flood, or any other natural disaster. Not with fear, not with hatred, with the calm, absolute certainty of someone who understands exactly what they are seeing and has already decided how they will respond to it. She whispered one word: remember. Then she died. I stood up. I brushed dust from my uniform. I told Voron to ensure the footage was broadcast immediately. All channels, all systems, mandatory viewing for human populations. I walked back to my shuttle without looking at her again. Within the hour, the footage was streaming across 900 star systems. Every human in the galaxy watched their emperor kneel beside a dying child. Every human in the galaxy heard her final word. I returned to my flagship and resumed my review of supply chain reports. I considered the matter closed. I believed I had sent the message I intended. I believed the silence that followed was the silence of submission. I was wrong about everything. Looking back now, I can identify the exact moment my empire began to die. It was not when the coalition formed. It was not when my vassal species began to defect. It was not when my own guard tried to end my life. It was the moment that footage went live. The moment 400 billion humans across dozens of worlds heard a 7-year-old girl whisper a single word to the most powerful being in the galaxy, and decided together, without coordination, without leadership, without a single order being given, that she was right. They would remember, and they would make certain that I did too. I did not notice the change immediately. Empires of 900 systems do not pivot on a single day. The machinery of governance continued to turn. Reports flowed upward through channels. Quotas were met. Schedules maintained. If I had been paying closer attention to the details instead of the totals, I might have caught the first signs within a week. But emperors do not pay attention to details. That is what advisors are for, and my advisors were as blind as I was. Sarath brought it to my attention, 12 days after Meridian 4. He stood before my throne in the audience chamber aboard the flagship, and I could see immediately that something was troubling him. Sarath was a veteran intelligence officer who had served 3 emperors before me. He did not trouble easily. There is an anomaly across the human territories, he said. He chose that word carefully. Anomaly. Not threat, not crisis, not rebellion. An anomaly. Something that did not fit the patterns his networks were trained to detect. I asked him to elaborate. Human productivity has not declined, he said. In fact, output across every industrial and agricultural sector staffed by humans is precisely at treaty-mandated levels. Compliance with all administrative requirements is at 100%. There are no protests, no demonstrations, no resistance cell activations. Every measurable metric suggests that the human population is functioning within expected parameters. I waited. Sarath was not the kind of officer who requested an audience with the Emperor to report that everything was functioning normally. They have stopped speaking, he said. I asked him to clarify. Not entirely. They speak to each other when operational necessity requires it, but they have ceased all voluntary communication with Valith personnel, every human, on every world, across every sector, simultaneously. I leaned forward on my throne. This was unusual but not, in my estimation, alarming. Conquered species often went through periods of sullen non-cooperation. It typically burned itself out within a few weeks, when the practicalities of daily life demanded engagement. How simultaneously? I asked. Sarath pulled up a timeline on his data display. The silence had begun within 6 hours of the Meridian 4 footage being broadcast. Not gradually, not spreading from world to world like a coordinated signal, but erupting everywhere at once. On the industrial world of Korvax 7, a human shift supervisor who had been mid-sentence during a briefing with his Valith overseer simply stopped talking. He completed his report in writing and returned to work. On the agricultural moon of Tellus 3, 12,000 human laborers showed up for their morning assignments without a word and completed a full day's work in absolute silence. On the capital world itself, human diplomatic staff attended a scheduled reception for visiting Faluri dignitaries and stood in polite, smiling silence for 3 hours without uttering a single sound. I told Sarath it would pass. It did not pass. Over the following weeks, the silence deepened. It was not merely the absence of speech. Humans withdrew from every form of social interaction with their Valith administrators that was not explicitly required by treaty. They stopped attending voluntary cultural events. They stopped participating in the recreational programs my governance council had established to promote integration. They stopped eating in shared dining facilities, choosing instead to take their meals separately, in groups composed exclusively of other humans, in complete silence. On the transit hub of Nexus Station, a human dock supervisor who had been known for his loud, friendly demeanor and his habit of greeting every Valith officer by name, now processed ships without lifting his eyes from his console. He worked faster than before. His error rate dropped to 0. He became, by every measurable standard, the most efficient dock supervisor in the sector, and he did not speak a single word that was not strictly required by docking protocol. His Valith counterpart, an officer who had worked alongside him for 3 years and considered him a colleague if not a friend, reported that the change was more unsettling than any act of open defiance she had ever witnessed. She wrote in her report that it felt like working beside someone who had died and been replaced by a machine wearing their face. My regional governors began sending increasingly confused reports. Governor Drellick on Korvax 7 wrote that his human workforce was outperforming their quotas by a small but consistent margin, which under normal circumstances would have been cause for commendation. But the way they worked disturbed him. They moved through their tasks with a mechanical precision that felt, in his words, like watching a machine that happened to wear human skin. They responded to direct orders immediately and exactly. They never hesitated, never complained, never asked clarifying questions, and they never, under any circumstances, spoke a word beyond what the order required. Governor Thalys, on the mining colony of Ashfeld 2, reported something stranger. Her human workers had begun a practice she could not explain. At the end of each shift, they would stand in a single line at the mine entrance and face the direction of Meridian 4. They would stand in silence for exactly 11 minutes. Then they would file out and return to their quarters. When she asked what they were doing, the shift leader wrote his answer on a piece of paper and handed it to her. One word. Remember. That word. It was appearing everywhere. My intelligence networks began tracking it, the way they tracked weapon signatures and fleet movements. Humans were not shouting it. They were not broadcasting it. They were simply placing it, with quiet persistence, into every surface and every space they touched. It was scratched into workbenches with fingernails. It was traced in condensation on windows. It was arranged in pebbles on pathways. It was woven into the patterns of agricultural fields in lines visible only from high altitude. It was tapped out in binary code on factory walls. It was braided into the wiring patterns of electrical systems, so that the word existed in the infrastructure itself, invisible unless you knew where to look. A Valith engineer on the manufacturing world of Kolrath 6 discovered it encoded in the serial numbers of circuit boards, the first letter of each batch number, spelling it out across a production run of 10,000 units. When he reported the discovery, his superiors investigated and found that human workers across the entire facility had been embedding the word into their output for weeks. Not a single product was defective. Not a single specification was violated. The word was simply there, woven into the fabric of everything they made, like a signature they could not stop themselves from leaving. On Tellus 3, the garrison commander, an officer named Varric, sent a report that stopped me mid-reading. His 12,000 human laborers, the workforce that fed an entire sector, had begun carving the word into the hulls of transport ships. Not vandalism, not destructive, precise, small, uniform letters placed in locations that did not compromise structural integrity. Every ship that left Tellus 3 carried the word into the wider galaxy. When Varric ordered the carvings removed, they appeared again overnight. When he posted guards, the carvings appeared in locations the guards were not watching. When he increased surveillance to full-spectrum monitoring, the carvings stopped on the ships and appeared instead in the grain fields, scored into the earth in letters 300 meters tall, visible from orbit. Varric asked for instructions. He wanted to know who was organizing this. He wanted ringleaders to arrest, a command structure to dismantle, a conspiracy to unravel. I told him there were no ringleaders. I was beginning to understand, dimly and with a discomfort I refused to examine, that what was happening across human space was not organized in any way my intelligence apparatus could detect, because it was not organized at all. There was no conspiracy. There was no leadership structure. There was no encrypted communications network coordinating actions across light years. 400 billion humans were acting in concert without a single order being given, without a single meeting being held, without a single plan being formed. I summoned Sophie Trent. Trent was a human cultural analyst who had been attached to my advisory staff as part of the post-treaty integration program. She was one of a handful of humans who still spoke to Valith officials with something approaching normal conversational patterns, though even she had become noticeably more reserved since Meridian 4. She was brilliant, I had to admit. Her analyses of vassal species behavior had been consistently more insightful than those of my Valith analysts, which was why I had kept her on staff despite the growing awkwardness of having a human in my inner circle. I asked her to explain what was happening. She stood before my throne for a long moment before answering. I noticed that her hands were clasped in front of her in a way I had not seen before. Her fingers were interlocked, thumbs pressed together, forming a shape that was neither prayer nor fist, but something between the two. "You broadcast the footage," she said. "Every human saw it." I told her that was the point. "Yes," she said, "but I do not think you understood what you were showing them." I told her to speak plainly. "You showed them a child who was not afraid of you. You showed them a child who looked at the most powerful being in the galaxy and, with her dying breath, gave him an instruction. And you showed them that you did not understand the instruction. You showed them that you heard the word and it meant nothing to you." I told her it was one word from a dying child. It meant nothing, because it was nothing. Sophie Trent looked at me with an expression I could not read. "That is exactly what I mean," she said. "You do not understand. And because you do not understand, you broadcast your ignorance to every human alive. You showed them that the most powerful being in the galaxy heard a child say, 'Remember,' and thought it was noise. And that, Emperor, is why they will never stop." I asked her what she meant. "You have unified them," she said. "Not with force, not with a cause, with a symbol. That child is not a casualty to them. She is a covenant. Every human who saw that footage made the same decision at the same moment. They did not need to coordinate, because the decision was the same for all of them. They will remember. And they will make sure you know they are remembering. And they will do it in ways you cannot punish, cannot outlaw, and cannot stop. Because the act of remembering is not a crime. It is not resistance. It is not defiance. It is simply memory. And you cannot make it illegal to remember." I dismissed her. I told her the silence would break when practical necessity demanded it. Humans would need to speak to function. They would need to cooperate to survive. The silence was an emotional response, and emotional responses faded. 3 days later, I issued a formal decree across the Dominion. The word remember was banned. Any human caught speaking it, writing it, displaying it, or encoding it in any form would be subject to immediate execution. I broadcast the decree on every channel. I told myself this would end it. Within 24 hours, the word vanished from every surface in the Dominion. The carvings were smoothed over. The field markings were plowed under. The window tracing stopped. The pebble arrangements were scattered. And then the humming began. A melody. 4 notes. Rising and falling in a pattern that spread from world to world faster than any communication signal could travel. Humans hummed it while they worked, while they walked, while they ate. Always softly, never loud enough to constitute a disturbance. My linguists analyzed the tonal pattern and reported their findings with visible unease. When mapped to human phonetic structure, The 4 notes spelled a word. I knew which word before they told me. I banned the melody. I banned humming in all forms. Any human caught producing a sustained musical tone would be detained. They stopped humming and began tapping. A rhythmic pattern, knuckles on surfaces, boots on floors, fingers on tables. The rhythm encoded the same 4-note melody, which encoded the same word. I banned rhythmic tapping. They shifted to a way of folding their hands, that same interlocked position I had seen Sophie Trent use. My analysts confirmed it had no prior cultural significance in any human society. It was new. It was invented in real time by 400 billion people simultaneously, and it carried a meaning that every human understood without being told. Sarath stood before me and delivered his assessment with the careful precision of a man who knew his emperor did not want to hear what he was about to say. "We cannot ban a gesture," he said. "We cannot ban the way people hold their hands. If we try, they will find something else. A way of standing, a way of breathing, a pattern in the way they blink. They are encoding the word into every available channel of expression, and they will continue to do so until they run out of channels, which they will not. Because the number of ways a human can express a concept through physical behavior is effectively infinite. I have studied 42 vassal species, Emperor. None of them have ever done anything like this. When you suppress a Drelkathi war cry, they grieve and eventually adapt. When you ban a Faluri harmonic, they find a different frequency, but the urgency fades. Humans do not fade, they compress. Every channel you close forces the message into a narrower space, and narrower spaces create greater pressure, and greater pressure creates something that cannot be contained by any force we possess." I stared at him. I was the supreme sovereign of 900 star systems. I had conquered species that bent the fabric of space. I had defeated armadas that spanned light years. And I could not stop a gesture. That night, alone in my chambers, I pulled up the footage from Meridian 4. I watched the girl's face. Those dry, steady eyes. I watched it 17 times. I told myself I was studying it for tactical intelligence, looking for something I had missed, some clue to the mechanism behind this impossible collective behavior. I was lying. I know that now. I was watching because the word had already begun to do what it was designed to do. It was making me remember. The fractures began, not among the humans but among my own kind, and that was the part I never anticipated. I had built the Valith Dominion on a simple principle that had held true for 600 years. Power flows downward. Obedience flows upward. The species at the top of the hierarchy dictate the terms of existence for every species beneath them, and those terms are accepted because the alternative is annihilation. It was not elegant, it was not just, but it worked, and it had worked for so long that I had confused its longevity with its permanence. I assumed that because the system had survived 6 centuries, it would survive 6 more. I did not understand that systems do not collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because the people inside them stop believing in them. The first crack appeared in my war council. Admiral Valis, commander of the Third Fleet and the officer responsible for the initial conquest of human space, requested a private audience 3 months after Meridian 4. Valis was old guard. She had served my predecessor and had been instrumental in putting me on the throne during the succession crisis 40 years ago. She was not a sentimentalist. She had ordered the orbital bombardment of 4 worlds during the Drelkathi rebellion without losing a minute of sleep. She stood before me in my private chambers and told me she was recommending a strategic reassessment of our human integration policy. I asked her what she meant. "The silence is spreading," she said. "Not among the humans, among our own people." She explained. On 7 Valith worlds, junior officers who had served in the Meridian 4 operation had begun requesting transfers. Not officially citing the operation as their reason, but their transfer requests all shared a common characteristic. They wanted to be reassigned away from human-populated sectors. One officer, a lieutenant named Kalith, who had led one of the entry teams at the school complex, had submitted a medical report claiming persistent auditory disturbances. He said he could hear children's voices in quiet rooms. The military physicians who examined him found no physical cause, but noted that 3 other officers from the same unit had reported identical symptoms. 4 officers hearing things is not a crisis, I told her. No, Villis agreed. But I have received similar informal reports from 12 garrison commanders across human space. They are not hearing voices. They are losing personnel. Valith soldiers assigned to human oversight duties are developing psychological complications at a rate 17 times higher than the baseline for equivalent postings. Depression, insomnia, loss of motivation, a condition our medical teams are calling moral injury, which appears to be a human psychological term they have borrowed because our own clinical vocabulary does not contain an equivalent concept. I told her to replace the affected personnel. I am running out of replacements, she said. The applicant pool for human sector postings has declined by 40% since the broadcast. Our soldiers are not refusing duty. They are simply not volunteering for it. And the ones who do volunteer are performing at diminished capacity because the silence is affecting them in ways they cannot articulate. She paused. I could see her choosing her next words with the care of someone diffusing an explosive. Emperor, she said, I have spent 40 years managing conquered populations. The standard cycle is predictable. Initial resistance, followed by gradual acceptance, followed by integration, or at minimum passive compliance. What the humans are doing does not fit this cycle. They are not resisting. They are complying with every requirement we have imposed. They are meeting every quota. They are breaking no laws. They are doing everything we have asked of them, and they are doing it in a way that is destroying the morale of every Valith soldier who has to watch them do it. I dismissed her, but her words stayed with me in a way that bothered me, because I could not find the flaw in her reasoning. The second crack appeared among the vassal species. The Drelkathi were the first to move. They were a proud species, warriors by culture and temperament, who had been conquered 40 years ago after a rebellion that cost them 3 homeworlds. They had accepted vassal status with the bitter compliance of a species that knew it was outgunned, but had not forgotten that it once stood free. I had always considered them a manageable risk. Their population was too small and their military too depleted to pose a genuine threat. But the Drelkathi were not planning a military challenge. They were doing something far more dangerous. They were asking questions. My intelligence networks intercepted communications between Drelkathi community leaders on 6 worlds. The communications did not discuss rebellion or resistance. They discussed the humans. Specifically, they discussed what the Drelkathi were observing in the human populations that shared their worlds. The silence, the gestures, the word, the absolute, implacable, unified refusal to grant the Dominion anything beyond the bare minimum of compliance. One intercepted communication between a Drelkathi elder named Korath and his counterpart on a neighboring world contained a passage that Serath flagged for my attention with a priority marker I had only seen him use twice before. The humans have found a weapon we did not know existed, Korath had written. They have discovered that obedience without consent is more corrosive than defiance. They comply with everything the Emperor demands, and in doing so, they have made the demands themselves feel hollow. Every quota met in silence is a reminder that the quota is met under duress. Every order followed without acknowledgement strips the order of its authority. They are obeying the Dominion to death. Korath's phrase, obeying to death, spread through the Drelkathi population within a week. It became a greeting, a farewell, a toast raised over evening meals. Drelkathi warriors who had once dreamed of open rebellion against the Dominion now spoke of the human strategy with something approaching reverence. They studied it, they analyzed its mechanics, they debated its applications to their own situation, and slowly, carefully, without issuing a single formal declaration, they began to implement it. Drelkathi workers in Dominion factories started meeting their quotas to the precise letter of their contracts. Not 1 unit more, not 1 hour of overtime, not 1 creative solution volunteered. They had learned the lesson the humans were teaching, and they were proving to be excellent students. Then it jumped to the Faluri, a vast insectoid collective that had served the Dominion for 3 centuries without a single recorded act of defiance. The Faluri did not use human gestures or whisper human words, but they began doing something that had never occurred in their entire history of vassalage. They started refusing overtime. Not all of them, not a strike, not a coordinated action, nothing that could be identified as organized resistance. Individual Faluri workers, scattered across hundreds of worlds, simply stopped working beyond their contractually mandated hours. When their supervisors questioned them, they cited the precise clause in their vassal treaty that defined their work obligations. They were doing exactly what was required of them, not 1 minute more. The effect on the Dominion's industrial output was significant. The Faluri provided approximately 30% of the Empire's refined mineral processing. Their willingness to work extended shifts had been a cornerstone of our production capacity for centuries. No one had ever thought to question it, because no one had imagined the Faluri would ever choose to stop. I summoned Sereth for a full briefing. "The vassal species are watching the humans," he said. "All of them, not just the Drelkothi and the Faluri. Every single vassal species in the Dominion is paying attention to what the humans are doing, and they are learning from it." He pulled up a data visualization that mapped behavioral changes across the Dominion's vassal populations. It looked like a contagion, starting from the human worlds, spreading outward through trade routes and shared colony worlds, touching one species after another. The changes were small. A work slowdown here, a cultural event canceled there, a diplomatic communication that was technically correct, but conspicuously devoid of the deference that had been standard practice for centuries. Individually, each change was insignificant. Collectively, they formed a pattern that made my blood run cold in a way I had not experienced since I was a young officer facing my first combat engagement. They are learning that compliance without cooperation can be a form of resistance, Sereth said. The humans are teaching them, not through words or propaganda, but through example. Every species in the Dominion is watching a conquered people bring the machinery of empire to its knees, without raising a single weapon, and they are realizing that they could do the same. I ordered increased surveillance across all vassal worlds. I doubled the garrison strengths in sectors with mixed human and alien populations. I authorized my intelligence services to use enhanced interrogation protocols on any vassal citizen suspected of coordinating with humans. None of it mattered. 3 Valith governors resigned their posts within the same week. They cited personal reasons. Their private communications, intercepted by my security services, told a different story. Governor Melith, of the Arcturus sector, wrote to her family that she could no longer administer a territory where the faces of the people she governed reminded her daily of what had been done in her name. Governor Drelak, the same officer who had reported the mechanical precision of his human workforce months earlier, simply wrote 3 words in his resignation letter. Words that my security services flagged immediately because they recognized the pattern, even if Drelak did not realize he was using it. I will remember. A Valith governor, writing a human word in a human pattern without being told to do so. The contagion was inside my own species now. 2 admirals requested transfers away from human-occupied sectors. A senior member of my advisory council, an elder statesman named Drossic, who had served 4 emperors, quietly approached me after a routine session and suggested that perhaps a gesture of reconciliation might be prudent. He spoke carefully, diplomatically, framing his suggestion as a strategic calculation rather than a moral one. He talked about cost-benefit analyses and long-term stability projections, and the historical precedent of post-conquest amnesty programs. I listened to him for 11 minutes. Then I had him executed in the council chamber. I wanted the other council members to see. I wanted them to understand that reconciliation was not a concept I was willing to entertain. Drossic died with dignity, which infuriated me in a way I could not articulate. He did not beg, he did not plead. He looked at me with an expression of profound sadness, not for himself, but for what I was becoming, and he closed his eyes, and that was the end of a man who had served the Dominion for longer than most species had existed. The chamber was silent for a very long time after his body was removed. The next morning, 4 more council members submitted requests for extended personal leave. I denied all 4. 2 of them resigned outright. I replaced them with military officers who I believed would be more compliant. They were. They were also less competent, less insightful, and less willing to tell me things I needed to hear, which meant that my ability to understand what was happening in my own empire deteriorated at the exact moment I needed it most. I watched their faces as Drossic died. I was looking for fear. I found it, but underneath the fear, in the back of their eyes, in the way they looked at each other when they thought I was not watching, I saw something else. Something I was beginning to recognize because I had seen it first in the eyes of a dying child. I summoned Sophie Trent for the second time. She arrived looking thinner than I remembered. The humans on my staff had been eating less since Meridian 4. Not a hunger strike, nothing so dramatic. They simply ate less. My medical officers reported that human caloric intake across the Dominion had declined by approximately 12%. Not enough to impair function, just enough to be visible. Just enough so that every Valith citizen who looked at a human saw someone who was choosing to carry a weight that did not need to be carried. I told her about the governors, the admirals, Rossic, the Faluri overtime refusals, the Drelkathi communications. I told her all of it because I needed to understand what was happening, and she was the only person in my court who might be capable of explaining it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Do you know what the word remember means to a human?" she asked. I told her it meant to recall past events. "No," she said. "That is what it means in a dictionary. What it means to a human is something else entirely. It is an instruction, a commandment. It is the most sacred obligation one human can place upon another," she explained. She told me about events in human history so distant that even her species' own records struggled to preserve them with accuracy. Events that had occurred thousands of years before humans left their homeworld. Wars, persecutions, atrocities. She told me that when a trauma was severe enough, humans did not simply grieve it and move on. They compressed the entire emotional weight of the event into a single symbol, a word, a date, a phrase, and they encoded it into their culture with such intensity that it became inseparable from their identity. They built monuments. They held ceremonies. They taught their children, and their children's children, and every generation that followed, to carry the weight of the original event as if it had happened to them personally. "There are humans alive today," she said, "who grieve for events that occurred 4,000 years ago, on a world they have never visited, in a land they have never seen, involving ancestors whose names they do not know. They grieve as if it happened yesterday, not because anyone ordered them to, because the word was spoken, remember, and once that word is spoken, once a human accepts the obligation it carries, it cannot be unspoken, it cannot be forgotten. It is woven into their identity at a level so fundamental that removing it would mean destroying who they are." She met my eyes, and I saw that she had been crying, silently, without wiping her face, the entire time she had been speaking. "You have not created a memory, Emperor," she said. "You have created a religion. Every human child born from this day forward will carry Meridian 4 in the core of who they are. It will be in their songs, their stories, their traditions, their prayers. 1,000 years from now, humans who have never heard your name will know the number 5,731 the way they know their own heartbeat. It will never fade. It will never diminish. In 10,000 years, they will remember as if it happened this morning." I destroyed her report. I had the data files purged from every system on my flagship. I told myself that she was wrong, that humans were short-lived creatures with short memories, that the intensity of their reaction would fade as the immediacy of the event receded into history. That night, I pulled up the footage again. I watched the girl's face. Those eyes, that steady, dry gaze that held no fear and no hatred and no despair. I had been watching the footage every night. I had not admitted this to anyone. I told myself I was analyzing it. I told myself I was looking for weaknesses, for leverage points, for something I could use to break whatever spell the footage had cast over the human population. But the truth was simpler and more terrible than that. The word was working, not just on the humans, not just on the Drelkathi and the Faluri and the vassal species who were learning to obey the Dominion to death. It was working on me. I was remembering. I was counting. 5,731. A number I had never bothered to learn when the operation was conducted. A number that now repeated in my mind with the regularity of a heartbeat. I had destroyed worlds. I had ended species. I had never counted. I had never needed to count. The dead were abstractions, statistics in reports I skimmed and filed. But this number would not let me go. It had attached itself to something inside me that I did not know existed, some capacity for accounting that my centuries of power had not managed to fully extinguish. I caught myself whispering it during a council meeting. Just the number, barely audible, under my breath while an admiral was presenting fleet readiness statistics. The admiral paused. He looked at me. I saw confusion in his expression, and underneath it, something that might have been concern. I told him to continue. He did. But later, when the session ended and the council members filed out, I noticed them glancing at each other. Those same sideways looks I had been cataloging for months. The looks that said something is wrong with the Emperor, and none of us wants to be the first to say it. They were right. Something was wrong with me. The girl's word had found its way past every defense I possessed, and it was growing inside me like a vine growing through the cracks in a wall. Slowly, patiently, with the absolute certainty of something that has all the time in the world. 14 months after Meridian 4, my empire was dying, and it was not dying the way empires are supposed to die. There were no great battles, no decisive military defeats, no charismatic rebel leader rallying the oppressed masses behind a banner of freedom. The Valith Dominion, which had taken 6 centuries to build, and which commanded more firepower than any political entity in the recorded history of the galaxy, was being disassembled from the inside by people who never raised a weapon, never broke a law, and never stopped working. The human engineers did it first. They were scattered across every critical system in the Dominion, maintaining the infrastructure that kept 900 star systems functioning as a coherent whole: power grids, communication networks, atmospheric processors, orbital platforms, transit systems, water purification, food distribution, all of it threaded through with human technical expertise that my predecessors had spent decades cultivating, because humans were, by a significant margin, the most skilled engineers among all the vassal species. What I had never appreciated, what none of my advisors had ever thought to quantify, was how much of the Dominion's functionality existed not because of the systems themselves, but because of the human technicians who maintained them, beyond their design specifications. Humans did not simply keep machines running. They optimized them, tweaked them, coaxed performance out of aging equipment through an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that bordered on artistry. A power grid that was rated for 90% efficiency ran at 98% when humans maintained it, because humans could not help themselves. They saw a machine, and they made it better. They stopped making things better. They did not sabotage anything. Sabotage would have been a crime, and crimes could be punished. Instead, they did something far more devastating. They began performing their duties exactly to specification. Not one adjustment beyond what the maintenance manual required. Not one optimization. Not one creative solution to an emerging problem. They followed the rules to the letter, and the letter of the rules had never been designed to sustain the level of performance the Dominion had come to depend on. Power grids that had run at 98% dropped to 60. Transit networks that moved cargo in 3 days now required 9. Communication relays that had been boosted beyond their rated range snapped back to factory defaults, creating dead zones that severed connections between sectors. Water purification systems that had been running on modified filtration algorithms reverted to standard protocols, reducing output by 1/3. My economic advisors presented projections that turned my stomach. The Dominion's economy had been operating on a margin of efficiency that was entirely dependent on human overperformance. Without it, we were not merely less productive, we were operating at a deficit. The cost of maintaining the empire exceeded the revenue it generated. Every month, the work to rule continued, the gap widened. I ordered my engineers to learn to do what the humans had been doing. Valith engineers studied the modifications the humans had made over decades of silent, uncredited optimization. They could not replicate them. The adjustments were not documented because the humans who made them had not considered them noteworthy. They were intuitive responses to observed problems, solutions that existed in the hands and minds of individual technicians and had never been written down. When my engineers tried to duplicate them, they either failed entirely or caused cascading malfunctions that made things worse. Then the walking began. On the colony world of Korvax 7th, 23,000 human workers left their dormitories at sunrise and began walking east. They carried nothing, They left behind their tools, their personal possessions, their quarters exactly as they had been when they woke up. They walked in silence, in orderly columns, toward the eastern border of the colony zone, beyond which lay open wilderness that stretched for thousands of kilometers to the coast of the planet's only ocean. The garrison commander contacted me in a state of controlled panic. "They are not running," he said. "They are not hiding. They are walking at a normal pace in a straight line. I can stop them at any time. I am asking for authorization to stop them." I asked him what they intended. "They will not say," he replied. "They will not respond to any communication. They are simply walking." Within 2 days, reports of identical marches were arriving from 37 worlds. Humans were walking. Millions of them. All in the same direction, relative to galactic coordinates. They were walking toward the border of Dominion space. They left behind everything. Homes that had been built and maintained over generations. Infrastructure they had designed and constructed with their own hands. Communities, schools, hospitals, gardens, libraries, everything that constituted a life. They walked away from all of it with the calm determination of people who had decided that a life under the Dominion was no longer a life they were willing to live. On the manufacturing world of Kolrath 6, the entire human engineering corps, 8,000 specialists who maintained the reactor systems that powered half the sector, walked out of their control rooms at shift change and did not return. They left the reactors running at minimum safe output, because even in their departure they would not endanger lives, but they left behind no documentation, no transition notes, no instructions for the Valith engineers who would need to take over. The Valith engineers lasted 41 hours before the first reactor scrammed due to a cooling imbalance they could not diagnose. Within a week, 3 more reactors had been shut down. The manufacturing output of the entire sector dropped to nothing. On the agricultural world of Tellus 3, the 12,000 laborers who had carved words into grain fields and hull plates walked in a column so long that orbital observation platforms tracked it as a single unbroken line stretching from the central settlement to the horizon. They sang as they walked, not the band melody, something new. A song with no words at all, just a rising, falling harmony that carried across the flat agricultural plains like wind. The garrison commander listened to it from his command post and did not issue the order to intercept. When asked later why he had not acted, he said simply that he could not bring himself to stop a sound that beautiful. My generals asked if they should use force to stop the marches. I hesitated. It was a moment, a fraction of a second, a pause so brief that no one in the command center should have noticed it. But they noticed. Every officer in the room saw their emperor hesitate when asked whether to deploy force against unarmed humans walking in a straight line. And in that hesitation, 3 vassal species read their future. The Drelkathi announced their withdrawal from the Dominion on the same day. Their statement was broadcast on open channels, unencrypted, clearly intended for the widest possible audience. They cited Meridian 4 by name. They called me a word in the Drelkathi language that does not translate precisely, but carries a meaning somewhere between one who destroys his own foundation and fool who eats his own hands. The closest human equivalent, I was later told, was something like the architect of his own ruin. The Faluri followed within 48 hours. Their withdrawal was less dramatic but more devastating. They simply stopped working. All of them. Every Faluri worker in the Dominion, across hundreds of worlds, set down their tools simultaneously and walked to the nearest Faluri community center. They did not issue a statement. They did not cite a grievance. They did not even formally announce their withdrawal. They just stopped. For a species that had defined itself through service for 3 centuries, the act of stopping was itself a revolution more profound than any armed uprising could have been. Their hive queens, who had maintained communication with my government through every previous crisis, went silent. When my ambassadors attempted to reach them, they were turned away at the entrance to the hive complexes by Faluri workers who simply stood in the doorway and did not move. They did not threaten. They did not argue. They occupied the space and waited for the ambassadors to leave. And the ambassadors, trained in every diplomatic protocol the galaxy had ever produced, found themselves utterly unprepared for the simple, devastating power of a closed door and a species that had decided it was done. The economic impact was immediate and catastrophic. 30% of the Dominion's mineral processing capacity vanished overnight. Supply chains that had been strained to breaking by the human work to rule now collapsed entirely. 6 systems lost power. 14 lost water purification. Emergency reserves that had been maintained for military contingencies were redirected to civilian populations, depleting our strategic stockpiles at a rate my logistics officers described as extinction level. Beyond the Dominion's borders, something was forming. Sereth's intelligence networks, which had been focused inward on the growing internal crisis, had missed the early stages of what the humans who reached free space were building. The Outer Rim Coalition, they called it, an alliance of minor powers, species too small and too scattered to have ever threatened the Dominion individually, now unified around a common purpose and armed with technology that should not have existed. Human refugees who crossed the border did not arrive as beggars. They arrived as architects. They brought with them decades of accumulated technical knowledge, the same intuitive engineering brilliance that had made the Dominion systems run at peak efficiency, and they offered it freely to any species willing to join the coalition. Shield harmonics that my fleet had never encountered. Propulsion modifications that gave coalition ships speed advantages my admirals could not explain. Weapons systems that operated on principles my scientists did not recognize. Medical technologies that cured diseases the Outer Rim species had considered endemic for centuries. Agricultural techniques that doubled food production on worlds that had been struggling to feed their populations. The humans gave all of it away. Every piece of knowledge, every innovation, every breakthrough they had developed during their decades of quiet, understated service to the Dominion. They asked nothing in return. Nothing except one thing, one word, one promise that every species who accepted human help was asked to make. Remember. And every species made it. Because every species in the Outer Rim had watched the footage. Every species had seen a child look at an emperor without fear. And every species understood, in whatever way their unique biology and culture allowed them to understand, that what had happened on Meridian 4 was not a human tragedy. It was a universal one. It was what happened when power was allowed to exist without accountability, when empires were permitted to treat the lives of the small as currency to be spent in the service of the large. The humans had been holding back. For their entire period of vassalage, they had been performing below their actual capability. The optimizations they had provided to the Dominion's infrastructure, the ones I had depended on, the ones my engineers could not replicate, represented a fraction of what they were truly capable of. They had given us enough to be useful, but never enough to be threatening. And now they were giving everything they had to the coalition. Seroth delivered this assessment to me in a voice that had lost the careful professional neutrality I had always associated with him. He sounded tired. Not physically tired, morally tired. Tired of watching his emperor make the same mistake in an endless variety of ways. They were never truly conquered, he said. They let us believe we had won. They let us build our empire on their labor, while they studied our weaknesses from the inside. They knew, from the very first day of vassalage, that they would eventually leave. Meridian 4 simply changed the timeline. I asked him how long we had before the coalition became a military threat. They became a military threat 4 months ago, he said. I chose not to tell you, because I did not believe you would respond proportionally. I should have executed him for that. Any emperor in history would have. I did not. I sat in my throne and stared at the data on his display and felt the number counting itself in the back of my mind. 5,731. 5,731. That night, the assassination attempt came. Not from humans, not from the coalition, not from the Drelkathi, or the Feluri, or any of the growing list of species who had turned against me. It came from 3 officers of my own Praetorian Guard. My personal protectors, the most loyal soldiers in the Dominion, selected through a process designed to eliminate any possibility of disloyalty. They came for me in my private chambers. 3 of them, moving in the precise tactical formation they had been trained to use for high-value target elimination. They were good. They were fast. But I had been a combat officer before I was an emperor, and my reflexes, enhanced by centuries of genetic modification and cybernetic augmentation, were faster. I killed 2 of them. The third, a captain named Vorik, I wounded and restrained. He lay on the floor of my chambers, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, looking up at me with an expression I could not read. I asked him why. "We were at Meridian 4, he said, all 3 of us. We were in the entry teams." I asked him what that had to do with attempting to end the life of his emperor. "I hear them," he said. "Every night. Every quiet moment. I hear the sounds they made. I cannot make it stop. None of us could make it stop." I asked him if this was his justification. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I recognized because I had been seeing it in my own reflection for months. A haunting. A weight that sat behind the pupils and pressed outward, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. "You gave us an order," he said. "We followed it, and it broke something inside us that we did not know could be broken. We are not traitors. We are not rebels. We are soldiers who were ordered to do something that soldiers should never be ordered to do, and we have been carrying it ever since, and we cannot carry it any longer." I executed all 3 personally. Protocol demanded it. An emperor who survived an assassination attempt was required to administer the final justice himself, publicly, to demonstrate that his authority remained absolute. My hands shook as I carried out the sentence. They had never shaken before. Not in 6 centuries of rule. Not during the succession war that put me on the throne. Not during any of the dozens of crises and conflicts and close calls that had marked my reign. They shook now, and everyone in the room saw it, and I knew that what little authority I had left died in that tremor. The Coalition fleet crossed into Dominion space on a Tuesday morning, by the human calendar. I know this because one of the human officers on my diminished staff mentioned it with the quiet, distant tone of someone noting a historical date they had been waiting for. The fleet was enormous. It should not have been possible for the Outer Rim Coalition to assemble a force of that size in under a year. My intelligence assessments had projected that the coalition would need at least 5 years to build a credible military presence, and even then, their numbers would be insufficient to challenge the Dominion's core fleets. My intelligence assessments were wrong by a margin that defied explanation. Sereth, who had remained at his post despite everything, provided the final briefing. Human shipyards in coalition space had been operating at a production rate that exceeded any known benchmark by a factor of 12. They were not building ships from raw materials. They were converting existing structures, cargo haulers, mining platforms, orbital habitats, even decommissioned stations, all of them redesigned and retrofitted with human engineering that transformed civilian infrastructure into warships. The Coalition fleet was not a fleet in the traditional sense. It was an entire civilization rearranged for war. Every ship bore the same marking on its hull, one word. I did not need anyone to tell me what it said. My border fleets engaged the coalition at the Calvex line, the same border where the original Treaty of Calvex had been signed. The irony was not lost on me. I watched the battle from my command center on the capital world, surrounded by the remnants of an advisory staff that had once numbered in the hundreds and now barely filled a single room. The battle was not a battle, it was a lesson. Coalition forces did not destroy my ships. They disabled them, with surgical precision that reflected an intimate knowledge of Valith warship design. Human-led attack squadrons targeted propulsion systems, weapons arrays, and communication nodes, leaving the ships intact but helpless. Every disabled vessel received the same broadband transmission, one word on every frequency, in every language, accompanied by a data packet containing exactly 5,731 names. The children, all of them, named. I learned later that human archivists had spent the 14 months since Meridian 4 compiling the list. Every child, every name, ages, interests, the subjects they had been studying when the soldiers came. One entry read, Lucy Ashworth, age 7, was learning to read maps on the day she died. Another read, Daniel Price, age 9, wanted to be an engineer. Another, Grace Whitfield, age 6, had just learned to write her own name. The names spread through my fleet, the way the word had spread through the human population. Valith sailors who read them shared them. Officers who received them forwarded them to other ships. Within hours, the list was circulating through the entire Dominion military, and the effect was devastating. 3 admirals surrendered their fleets without firing a shot. Not to the coalition. They simply powered down their weapons, opened their channels, and broadcast the list of names alongside their own service records, as if presenting evidence at a trial. 12 more fleet commanders followed within a day. My navy, the largest military force in the galaxy, was dissolving not because it had been defeated, but because its officers could no longer look at their crews and give orders in the name of an emperor who had earned a list of 5,731 names. The vassal species saw it happening and acted. The Drelkathi, who had been quietly arming since their withdrawal, deployed their restored fleet alongside the coalition. They broadcast a single message to the Dominion. Today we remember with them. Tomorrow we will remember for ourselves. The smaller vassal species followed. Species I had barely thought about. Species whose names I had to look up in the imperial registry, declared their independence, and joined the coalition in a cascade that collapsed the political structure of the Dominion faster than my analysts could track. I sat in my command center and watched my empire come apart, not with the spectacular violence of a military defeat, but with the quiet, methodical disassembly of a structure that had lost the consent of everyone inside it. Sectors that had been loyal for centuries declared neutrality. Supply lines that had fed the capital went dark. Communication networks that had connected 900 systems fragmented into regional clusters that stopped responding to imperial commands. Sarath was the last to leave. He stood before me in the empty command center, the displays around us showing a galaxy that no longer recognized my authority. He did not resign. He did not make a speech. He simply placed his intelligence chief's insignia on the console and looked at me with an expression that held no anger, no contempt, no satisfaction, just the exhausted recognition of a man who had watched an inevitable conclusion arrive on schedule. "You should have listened to Sophie Trent," he said. Then he walked out. I remained on the capital world as the coalition fleet entered orbit. I could have fled. I had contingency plans for exactly this scenario, hidden jump routes and safe houses scattered across the galaxy's most remote regions. I did not use them. I was tired of running from a word I could not outrun, because it was already inside me. The coalition forces landed at dawn, human soldiers, moving in disciplined formations through the empty streets of a capital city whose population had largely evacuated in the preceding weeks. They were quiet, not silent, the way the humans had been silent during the months of the Great Refusal. This was a different kind of quiet. Respectful, somber, the quiet of people performing a duty they considered sacred. They entered the imperial palace without resistance. My remaining guard, a handful of loyalists who had nowhere else to go, laid down their weapons when asked. No one was harmed. No one was threatened. The human soldiers cleared each room with professional efficiency, securing the building not as conquerors but as custodians. I was sitting on my throne when they reached the audience chamber. I had not moved from it in 3 days. I had not eaten or slept. I had been sitting in the dark, listening to the number count itself in my mind, watching the footage of the girl on a screen I had set to loop, letting the word do what it had been doing since the first moment I heard it. They did not raise their weapons. They did not shout orders. 27 human soldiers entered the chamber and arranged themselves in a semicircle before the throne. Then they stood in silence and waited. A woman walked through the line and stopped before me. She was not a general. She was not a politician. She was not wearing a uniform. She was a civilian, middle-aged by human standards, with the kind of face that suggested a life spent in the company of children. Her name, I later learned, was Martha Hale. She was a schoolteacher. She had taught at the education complex on Meridian 4. She had survived because she had been visiting family on another world when the operation occurred. She carried a data tablet. She held it in both hands, the way one might hold something precious and breakable. She did not look at me with hatred. She did not look at me with triumph. She looked at me with the same steady, dry-eyed clarity that I had seen in the face of a dying girl 14 months ago, and I understood, finally, completely, what that expression meant. It was not the absence of emotion. It was the presence of something so vast and so deep that it had burned through every smaller feeling and left behind only itself. It was the look of someone who was keeping a promise. She began to read names. Lucy Ashworth, age 7. Daniel Price, age 9. Grace Whitfield, age 6. Henry Carr, age 11. Sophie Allen, age 8. Peter Dean, age 10. She read each name individually. She spoke clearly, without hurry, giving each name the same weight and the same silence afterward. A moment of space, a breath, then the next name. It took over an hour. I sat on my throne and listened. I did not interrupt. I did not look away. I did not move. Something inside me had broken months ago, broken the way Vorik said it had broken inside the soldiers who followed my order, and the breaking had left behind a hollow space that was now being filled with names. 5,731 names, each one landing in that hollow space, like a stone dropped into still water, each one sending ripples outward through whatever was left of who I had been before the word found me. When she finished the last name, Martha Hale lowered her tablet and looked at me. The chamber was absolutely silent. 27 soldiers stood without moving. The air felt heavy with something that was not quite grief and not quite judgment, but contained elements of both. She asked me a question. One question, the only question that mattered. Do you remember? I opened my mouth. I had intended to say something imperial, something defiant, or dignified, or at least coherent, something befitting the supreme sovereign of 900 star systems, even a sovereign whose systems no longer answered his call. What came out was the number, 5,731. My voice broke on the last syllable. It was a sound I had never heard from my own throat, a cracking, a fracturing, the sound of 6 centuries of power splitting down the middle like a stone that had finally absorbed more weight than it could bear. Martha Hale nodded, just once. A small motion that communicated something I did not have words for in any of the 14 languages I spoke. They did not execute me. I had expected execution. I had prepared for it, in the way that one prepares for something inevitable and arguably deserved. Execution would have been simple, clean, a final exercise of power, even if the power belonged to someone else. They did not imprison me. A cell would have been comprehensible. A defined space, defined rules, defined duration, something I could measure and endure, and eventually outlive. What they did was worse, and better, and the only thing that could have been done, though I did not understand that until much later. They took me to Meridian 4. The colony had been rebuilt. Not restored, rebuilt. The humans who returned to Meridian 4 after the Coalition's victory did not attempt to recreate what had been destroyed. They built something new, a living settlement, growing and changing, filled with the sounds and rhythms of a community that had chosen to exist in the exact place where existence had been most violently denied. They placed me in a small room on the second floor of a building that overlooked the memorial where the education complex had once stood. The room had a window, a bed, a table, and a screen mounted on the wall that I could not turn off. Every morning, 5,731 names scrolled across the screen. Every name, one after another, in the same order Martha Hale had read them, followed by a brief entry. Lucy Ashworth, age 7, was learning to read maps. Daniel Price, age 9, wanted to be an engineer. Grace Whitfield, age 6, had just learned to write her own name. The screen ran all day. It ran all night. It never stopped. Below my window, the memorial courtyard filled with life. Human families who had returned to Meridian 4 or come from other worlds to settle there. Children, new children, born after the liberation, named and loved and taught in schools, built on the same ground where the old school had stood. They played in the courtyard every afternoon. I could hear them through the glass. Laughter, arguments, the thud of balls being kicked, the high, clear voices calling to each other, in the universal language of children who do not yet know that the universe contains anything to be afraid of. They knew I was watching. I think they had been told, or perhaps they had simply figured it out the way children figure things out, through observation and whispered conversations, and the peculiar intuitive intelligence that adults consistently underestimate. Occasionally, one of them would look up at my window. They never waved. They never shouted. They just looked, with that same steady clarity I had first seen in a dying girl's eyes, and then they returned to their games. No one came to gloat. No one came to lecture. No one came to explain the symbolism of what they had done, because the symbolism did not need explanation. I was the emperor who had ordered the destruction of 5,731 children, and my punishment was to spend the rest of my life surrounded by the sound of children living. My species lives a very long time. The genetic modifications that sustain the Valith ruling class give us lifespans measured in centuries. The humans who designed my containment knew this. They knew that I would sit in this room for longer than any human lifespan, watching names scroll across a screen, listening to children play, carrying the number in my mind the way they carried it in theirs. There is a plaque on the wall of the memorial courtyard. I can read it from my window on clear days. It bears one word. I understand it now. I understand what the girl was telling me when she whispered it with her last breath. She was not making a request. She was not issuing a threat. She was not even speaking to me. Not really. She was speaking to every human who would ever hear the recording, and she was giving them the most powerful instruction one human can give another. Do not let this be forgotten. Do not let this become a number in a report. Do not let time and distance and the natural human impulse toward healing smooth this over into something manageable. Carry it, feel it, let it change you. Pass it on. Make sure that those who come after you carry it too, and those who come after them, and those who come after them, until the weight of it has reshaped the world into something that would not allow it to happen again. I have had a great deal of time to think in this room, years now. I have watched the memorial courtyard fill with trees that were saplings when I arrived, and are now tall enough to shade the benches where old men and women sit in the afternoon sun. I have watched children grow into adults who walk past my building without looking up, because they have lives to live and a future to build, and an emperor in a window is not worth the interruption of either. I have thought about power, about what it means and what it costs, and what it cannot do. I conquered 900 star systems. I commanded fleets that could crack planets. I ruled for 6 centuries with an authority so complete that the concept of challenge had become theoretical. And all of it, every ship and every soldier and every world and every century, was undone by a 7-year-old girl who looked at me without fear and gave me an instruction I was too arrogant to understand. The screens are showing the names again. They always are. Lucy Ashworth, Daniel Price, Grace Whitfield, Henry Carr, Sophie Allen, Kitty Dean, 5,725 more. I know them all now. Every name, every age, every brief, heartbreaking entry that describes a child who was learning, or dreaming, or growing, on the day my soldiers walked through their door. Below my window, the children are playing. I can hear them, laughing, shouting, living. The sound used to torment me. Now it is something else, something I do not have a word for in my own language. The closest human term, I think, is penance, but it is not exactly that either. It is the sound of the thing that replaced my empire, the thing that the girl's word built in the space where my power used to be. A future. Not mine, theirs. A future I tried to destroy and could not, because the people I tried to break were carrying a weapon I did not know existed. A single word, 4 syllables, in a language I had not bothered to learn. A word that ate an empire, toppled a throne, unified a galaxy, and broke the most powerful being in the known universe without firing a shot. Every night, alone in this room, I hear the children settling into sleep in the buildings around the courtyard. The laughter fades, the shouting dims, the settlement grows quiet. And in the quiet, I whisper the word to the ceiling, because it is the only word I have left, the only word that matters, the only word that ever mattered, and I was too blind and too proud, and too certain of my own invincibility to understand it, until a dying child spoke it directly into my face, and I broadcast my ignorance to the stars. I remember. That is my punishment. That is their victory. That is the word that outlived my empire, and will outlive me, and will outlive every monument, and every institution, and every throne that ever was or ever will be. I remember every single one,